national park rangers, and any other profession that takes you far out into the wilderness. What are the strangest, weirdest things you have seen or heard or experienced while out there? I work in the outdoor field and lead trips regularly. I once led a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in NC. It's a tough climb to get to the top and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and had one co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon, and from the position I was in, I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I laid there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. I could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but it may have been 10. He then turned, sat down under a tree facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that made it clear he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do. I decided to wait it out. I waited, just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then, he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came up on. To this day, I have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. I was working as a prospector's assistant in central Manitoba one summer. We were conducting a helicopter-assisted magnetic anomaly investigation. It was the best summer of my life. There's nothing like the ringing in your ears dissipating after the helicopter has dropped you off and the slowly increasing volume of the bugs taking its place. You know for sure you are in the middle of nowhere. It was the last day of our campaign. This was a small piece of the property close enough to a road that we didn't need a helicopter. It was a low-priority target that was saved until the end. We had done so well during the high-priority targets that we decided to tackle this one on the last day for an easy in and out of the bush. Around 9 a.m., we heard yelling in the bush. Odd. Nobody else should be out here. We kept on grabbing samples, and it was in the back of our minds. Around 11 a.m., we heard it again, a little closer this time. We called back, but again, it was silent. Through our travels across this 30-kilometer piece of property, we came across many signs of wildlife. Deer, moose, and rabbit droppings were everywhere. A few carcasses here and there. We had seen bear tracks and bear feces a few times, but nothing prepared us for what happened next. Around noon, we were in an old blast hole from the 80s. Prospector Dave told me he used to have a blasting license, and that blowing things up in the middle of the forest while drinking beer was a favorite pastime of prospectors until they changed the laws after a few too many forest fires. We were facing due west with our GPS on some rocks, getting the most precise UTM it could. Then, we heard an earth-shattering, bone-chilling howl. I looked at Dave, and he turned so pale he was almost green. I picked up the GPS, put it in my belt, and unclipped my bear spray safety. At our 9 o'clock, facing due west, I saw one wolf, then another, at our 10 o'clock, then another, and another, all the way to our 4 o'clock. Dave calmly said, "We need to leave, but you cannot run. If you run, you die." We left most of our sampling equipment behind. We also carried these modified steel sledgehammers for breaking rock and scraping moss. They were the most useful and durable things I've ever had. It was at the ready, along with my bear spray as we walked. The longest walk of my entire life. We didn't say a word. I didn't hear anything, but I'm positive they followed us back to the road and into the truck. We drove back to town and proceeded to get thoroughly drunk. There was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return time from a camping trip. A good friend and I know the area very well, so one of the search and rescue guys we're friends with called us in to assist in the search. He and I headed out in the general direction the teens had set off in. We'd been hiking for most of the day and had seen nothing. We were about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point when we started noticing odd things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings in the trees, and a child's stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't on the regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Someone had been there within a couple of hours of us and had made these things. Mind you, we were still looking for these teens. We kept hiking and eventually made camp for the night, still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settled down anyway and went to sleep. We got up with the sunrise, hoping to cover more ground before it got too hot. We packed up the gear and got ready to go when I noticed a bit of shirt caught on a small tree and ripped, along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close to the teens, when a radio call came through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometers east of us. They were calling everybody back. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind. We wasted no time hiking out of those woods. I am a seasonal ranger for my local forest district. Despite living in a fairly suburban area, the forest preserves still make up 12% of the county, with much of the property being heavily wooded. It's not far out wilderness, but it is pretty secluded in some areas. Being a seasonal employee, I have been on the job for a bit over a month now. In my short time here, I have encountered a deceased man in a tree. The other rangers say they typically find about one suicide a year, so here was the one for this year. When we go around opening parks each day, we drive through to make sure everything is okay. In this instance, I was driving through and had just lost sight of the road when I saw a man hanging from a tree in a clearing. He had ended his own life. I called the police and the coroner. The coroner took an hour to show up, and he was the only one with a ladder long enough to remove the body. So, I stared at a deceased man in a tree for an hour. A frantic, drug-impaired, naked man running around a parking lot. It took me and 3 other rangers to catch him. When we finally apprehended him, we discovered he had multiple cuts across his body from running through brush and a rock lodged firmly in an uncomfortable place. A headless deer. Normally, when a pack of coyotes takes down a deer, yes, we have a lot of coyotes around here, they leave bite marks all over the body along with torn flesh everywhere. However, the head was cleanly sliced off and placed directly next to the body, indicating that this was likely the result of human intervention. We still haven't figured that one out yet. And I have only been here for 5 weeks. I live in northeast Oklahoma and consider myself a camping and fishing enthusiast. One spring night, 2 friends and I decided to go fishing. It was around midnight, and we were heading to a place that was once a maintained primitive camping area. This is not a remote location, but it's not very well known either. As we approached the turnoff for our spot, we saw another vehicle slowly turning out of it and proceeding in the direction we had come from. We passed them, and one of my friends remarked that he thought no one else would be around. We arrived at our spot, unloaded our gear, and began to prepare. But as we chatted and drank a few beers, we all felt an unspoken uneasiness. Something was just not right. Usually, I'm a trooper, fishing until the sun comes up, but I was the first to crack. I explained to my friends that we should leave because I had a bad feeling. They agreed, and we loaded up. While slowly driving through the old campground, we noticed some brightly glowing embers in an area where no one had been. My friend, who was driving, stopped without hesitation and went to take a look. He was startled and told us to come see. What we found were the remains of 3 crosses made of wood, each about 12 inches tall if upright. They had been burned, along with a small campfire. To make it even more unsettling, all were lying on freshly turned soil that resembled a freshly dug grave. We freaked out and got out of there fast. Thank you, sweet baby Jesus. We all thought we were home free. But as we approached the exit of the old campground, we noticed a vehicle parked on the side of the road. We passed it and realized it was the same car we had passed on the way in. There was no one in the car. They had doubled back and were likely watching us, waiting to do who knows what. An entire locomotive, complete with a tree growing through it. It's not work, but one of my hobbies is model railroading. Some years ago, back in the late 90s, I decided to build a model railroad based around a small, short, logging, lumber railroad that had existed in the northeast part of Georgia. The railroad itself had gone belly up sometime in the mid-1940s during the war, with the majority of the sawmill buildings and tracks being pulled up and used for scrap metal. What wasn't removed had been left to rot in place. Since most logging cars of the day were just wood frame structures, with only the trucks, wheel sets, and couplers being metal, I didn't expect to find that much. About 2 hours into mapping the old cuttings and bridge locations, I came across this branch line that curved off from the main. The branch wasn't on any of the maps I had, some of which dated back to the 1900s when the line was built, so naturally, I became curious. Tromping along, I noticed that the rails were still in place. Although it was badly overgrown and the ties were rotted, it looked in generally good condition. About 1.5 miles down this branch, as I came around a group of trees, I came face to face with an old steam locomotive. The thing looked like it had been there for some years, at least 50, if not more. It was battered and severely damaged from the wildfires that run through that area from time to time. I took several photos of it and then headed home. The next day, I went to a local railway historical society to ask if they knew about it. Here's where it gets weird. Speaking with them, I was told that they had heard about it and wondered if I had marked on the map where it was. I showed them, and then had the photos developed. Not a single one that I took of the locomotive turned out. Those taken before it and after it were fine, but every single one of the engine itself was just black, as though the film had gotten exposed. The Historical Society never found the locomotive, and over the course of the next year, before I moved further south, I kept looking for it. Try as I might, I could not find it, even following the railroad as I had before. It was almost as though the thing had never been there. The scariest experience I had as a backcountry park ranger in Washington state was being stalked by a cougar for a day and a half. I was hiking up an unpopular trail to an old shelter and had that creepy, being watched feeling. I had seen fairly fresh cougar scratches and scat along the trail, but that's pretty common up here, so I wasn't worried at all. That night, I camped at the shelter, which only had 3 walls and a roof. I felt uneasy all night and hardly slept. At one point, chiding myself for being paranoid, I arranged my emergency foil tarp around my sleeping bag so I could hopefully hear something if it approached me while I slept. The next day, I found fresh scat and scratches on the trail I had hiked in on. About 1 mile past the shelter, I found a mostly eaten deer in some dense brush off the trail. Cougars often keep their kills stashed throughout their territory for later snacking. Now, a cougar won't usually tangle with a human, but here I am, a 5-foot-tall, 100-pound sack of flesh and bones, at least 13 miles out from any other humans. I decided to cut short my 3-day trip and hurriedly made my way out of there. The last 2 hours of hiking through dusk in a dense forest was the most hair-raising hike I've ever had. I didn't know I was capable of being that hyper-vigilant. As a field botanist in Oregon, pre-legalization, I was always told by my supervisors that if I should ever stumble upon black hoses in the woods, I was to immediately turn around, head back to base, and let them know. Apparently, growers use the hoses to pipe water to their crops hidden deep in BLM or FWS land. Wildland firefighter with the Forest Service. Not my story, but from an old supervisor of mine whom I completely believe. The setting is around 2013, in the Hells Canyon area of Middle Idaho. His crew had been working all day on an emerging incident and were going to be working through the night as well. Being the assistant superintendent of the crew, second in charge effectively, he was out ahead scouting on an ATV or something similar. He was working his way down a logging road that clearly had not been used in some time when a bobcat or lynx, it's been a few years since I heard it, appeared in the middle of the road, but didn't run away as they usually would. The animal stood there for a good 10 seconds, screamed at him, and then scampered up a tree not 5 feet off the road. He found this odd, but not particularly unsettling. Just a half-mile or so down the road, he found a small cabin. Also odd, as this is federal land, and no private structures should be there. Upon investigation, all the windows had been boarded shut tight, and someone had done a good job of doing so. The doorknob had been punched out and secured to a hole drilled into the log frame by a chain. Someone did not want anything getting in or out. Peering through the hole in the door, he could see that everything in the house was in disarray. This left him feeling somewhat unsettled, so he hopped on his ATV and headed back up the road. Here's where it gets really interesting. Right where the bobcat had been, there stood a Native American woman in a badly tattered nightgown and bare feet, just standing there. He yelled at her, asking if she needed help. She just screamed at him, the same scream as the cat from before, and climbed right up the tree, faster than any human has a right to be climbing. Obviously, he left the area as fast as he could. Unsure of who or what he had just seen, he asked a local about the cabin. After asking around a little, a local Native American heard them talking and informed them that they had seen a pumawa, excuse the likely butchered spelling. In effect, a skin changer, a warg. Now, I would not believe most people who tried to tell me that. But this was a serious man who did not mess around about many things. He was dead serious the 2 times I've heard him tell it, and I 100% believe he saw what he saw. A couple of years ago, I went camping with my brother and an old roommate of mine. This was in one of the national forests in Oregon. We were pretty high up, kind of near an old ghost town. It wasn't really a dangerous area, but there were a lot of black bears and some cougars. I set up my hammock with a tarp draped over it to keep the rain out. Then, I got pretty drunk and went to bed. Since I drank my weight in beer, I woke up in the middle of the night and had to pee. I lifted up the tarp to peek out with a flashlight, and that's when I saw 2 eyes staring back at me. They were about 20 feet away. I was using one of those cheap $2 hardware store LED lights, so it didn't throw a beam. I couldn't see what was behind the eyes. All I could see was that they were far apart. My first instinct was to turn off the light and stay where I was, but it was so close, and then I wouldn't be able to see it. We had 3 guns, but I left mine in the truck. I came to the conclusion that the only thing to do was to stay perfectly still and keep the light on so I could see it. I draped my other leg out of the hammock and was ready to bolt for the truck if it charged me. I stayed in this position for what felt like forever until I noticed that the eyes had not moved at all. So I took a chance. I slowly got out of the hammock and started moving around the eyes, keeping about 20 feet between us. I was moving towards the truck. Once I got to the side, I saw it. It was a pair of binoculars, left open and sitting on a stump. With a light, they reflect just like a pair of eyes, and in my half-drunk state, it never occurred to me that this could be a possibility. I put the binoculars away and went to sleep. I know that this isn't an actual dangerous experience. I've encountered wild animals before, but this is by far the most scared I have ever been, and for the longest amount of time. I have many strange stories as I spend a lot of time in the wilderness, often alone, but this one just happened a few weeks ago and was absolutely crazy. I am typing with chills running through my body and goosebumps even thinking about it. I like to camp at a lake in northern Arizona that is rather remote. My favorite spot is on a finger bluff, with cliffs on both sides, and a lake, creek, and rich wildlife zone below. This area is home to the most wildlife in AZ: elk, deer, bear, wildcat, wild turkey, porcupine, and so on. A few times at this site, we had headed off for day hikes or to go to a lookout point and returned to camp to find a pungent stench hanging over the site. I would describe it as a mix between a cow-horse stable and horse sweat, like when you take the saddle off on a hot day, with a little bit of skunkiness. I know what elk and bear smell like. I can't explain the smell. This happened multiple times on different trips, and the strange part is that the smell is gone within a minute or two of us returning to camp. Anyway, a few weeks ago, my good friend and I decided to go camping at that spot last minute on a whim. I needed to spread some of my dog's ashes in the area. We started packing up at about 7 p.m. on Friday, and were just getting into the off-road section by around 2 a.m. It started snowing nearly blizzard conditions once we got off-road. It was so bad that we had to go about 16 km/h because the snow was blowing sideways, and we could not see to navigate. It was sticking and getting deeper by the minute. We were going rather deep in and doing some serious 4x4ing. We knew we might be stuck at the spot for a few days, but we had what we needed. We arrived at camp at about 3 a.m. and got our tent set up. The snow had stopped, and we were standing in a winter wonderland, lit brightly by the moon. We decided to walk 9 or 12 meters out of camp to the cliff's edge to look at the lake before bed. The lake tapers into a creek and lush wildlife zone about 300 meters below us. This is AZ, so seeing the lake in the snow is a real treat that I hadn't experienced before. We were standing there in complete eerie silence, the kind that you only find in the snow, admiring the beauty of nature, and talking about how lucky we were to be there while sipping our beers. We noticed the echo off of the opposing cliffs in the silence about 800 meters away, so naturally, I let out my best rendition of a Bigfoot war cry. My buddy followed suit. We both got a few out when, mid-war cry, my friend was cut off by a blood-curdling scream from back behind us on the other side of camp, maybe 60 meters away. There is an extremely rugged cliff on that side leading down to a creek marsh area. I have heard elk as well as wild turkey call from that area. Now, here is where my hair is standing up as I type. Before we could even process what we had just heard, something very large and heavy jumped into the lake creek directly below us, with a loud thump and splash, as if someone did a cannonball, then bobbed back up to the surface. There was a delay, and then something started kicking and splashing violently, swimming across the water toward us. You could clearly hear the legs kicking like a human, very powerfully. You could hear the concussion in the water with each kick. Splash, 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 splash. It sounded like a 227-kg man who is a poor swimmer, fully clothed with boots swimming. There was no delay in any of the actions. It was very deliberate and obvious that it was coming directly toward us. The splashing continued for a few moments. Then we heard it reach our side of the water, and, without any delay, you heard the dripping and the river rocks clinking as it got out of the water and immediately started smashing through the brush toward us at a constant pace. At this point, we were looking at each other and couldn't believe what was happening. My friend already had his pistol holstered on his belt, but mine was back at the truck. Breaking limbs soon gave way to the sound of something scrambling over boulders as it made its way up the hill toward us. We stood there as long as we could until it was obvious it would be closing in on us in a minute or less. I was no longer comfortable being there unarmed, so we both bailed back to camp to get my gun. We stood around for a while longer in complete silence, trying to hear anything, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, and we headed to bed at about 4 a.m. The rest of the trip was uneventful. What animal, at 3 a.m., just after a blizzard, with a few inches of snow on the ground, jumps completely into freezing water and moves directly toward humans screaming loudly in the night? That is what I want to know. I can't explain it. My only explanation is that maybe if a predator was chasing something, that could explain it. But why would it run up a nearly vertical 300-meter hill cliff toward shrieking humans? It would be the hardest, slowest route for it to take to escape a predator. That also doesn't explain the other scream, howl we heard, or why this thing sounded obviously bipedal. The area is extremely remote, and any human or hoaxer would have been in an immediate survival situation after going in that water. I spent about 3 months on a wilderness excursion with a group called NOLS. For the first segment, we spent 2.5 weeks backpacking through the Gila National Forest. To give you an idea of how far into the backcountry we were, We carried all our food for about 6 or 7 days each, found our own water, and used rocks for hygiene. Got the idea now? Good. So, we were about day 5 into our first ration, meeting a pickup truck on a remote dirt road the next day, and had to take a shortcut so we wouldn't miss it. If we did, we'd have to wait another week for food, and we were already running low. We decided to cut through a section of private property to save half a day of travel and make it to our location on time. However, we weren't able to make it all the way through this property and still camp near water access. We scoped the area and found a couple of old, run-down hunting shacks. They mostly looked abandoned or just used during hunting season. We found a nice grassy field to set up camp and a soft spot under some pine needles to set up our kitchen area. With dinner cooking on our camp stoves, tents set up, and the sun setting, we saw a hound bounding over from the trees, followed by a long-bearded, long-haired hermit shouting at us. If you've never been out in the wild or lived in a rural area, there are 2 types of people you might find living as hermits. 1. The kind who are absolutely eccentric, having spent years isolated and accumulating an impressive collection of firearms. Or 2. The kind who moved away from people to find inner peace and commune with nature. We were unsure which type this guy was. He came running over shouting, "Who the heck are you all, and what are you doing on my land?" Not wanting to risk confrontation, we tried to calmly explain. "Oh, we didn't realize we were trespassing. We're just passing through on our way to a ration meetup. We're very sorry. We can leave if you want." "Well, how long are you staying?" he asked sharply. "Just for the night. We'll be gone by first light." "Oh, well then. You can stay." That went smoother than expected. It turns out he used to be a heavy drinker and motorcycle enthusiast. He got very drunk at a bar one night, tried to ride home on his bike, crashed somewhere along the way, and woke up 3 days later in the hospital. His BAC was dangerously high. He shouldn't have survived. That day, his wife gave him an ultimatum: give up drinking forever or lose her and the kids. When he left the hospital, he found a real estate office, asked for the most remote plot of land available, and built a house there. All my friends were drinkers, and I couldn't be around them. Had to move somewhere I didn't know anyone. Found this plot of land, built a house, and now I make furniture out of white aspen. He invited us to his workshop the next morning. I was just glad that when we woke up, no one was missing. The next day, he showed us the shop, introduced us to his lovely wife, and we said our goodbyes. We started with handshakes, but by the end, he was giving bear hugs with tears in his eyes. And that is the story of Harold. Summer camp counselor here. I work every summer for a camp for 5 weeks. One time, we were backpacking to the tallest peak in my state. At night, a co-worker and I went on a night hike to get away from the kids. We laid down on a slope in a patch of grass to stargaze about a quarter mile from everyone else. As we were lying there, I heard the beautiful sound of water behind me, and I mean beautiful. I'd never heard water running before and thought to myself, wow, this sounds beautiful. All I could imagine was crisp, clear water gracefully trickling by. I had this image stuck in my head. I had this sudden urge to go find it. Not just an urge, but a need to find the creek. Now, behind us was dense forest and brush, so it would have been hard to find it at night, but it sounded somewhat close to us. My friend and I looked at each other without saying a word. I knew he was having the exact same thought as me. I said to myself, let's wait for 5 minutes, then we'll decide if we should check it out or not. It felt like a playful presence was trying to persuade us to go over there. Then I decided we should go check it out, and we stood up without saying anything to each other. It just sort of happened. As we were approaching the sound, it became quieter and quieter. We stopped, not knowing if we wanted to continue. As we stood there, the noise of trickling water became louder and louder until it sounded like standing next to a river. I then said, let's come back tomorrow to find it, and we agreed to come back later. When I made that decision, the sound of the creek vanished along with the urge to go. There was only silence. The presence I felt earlier suddenly became sinister. It was just this dark feeling of a presence, kind of similar to knowing when someone is watching you. I felt this fear slowly creeping up from my belly. We walked back to camp quickly without speaking. Once we got back, we started talking about what had just happened. My friend had the exact same urge to find the creek and the same internal battle in fighting the urge to go look for it. When we got back, it was like a trance had been lifted, and only then did we realize that what happened was not normal. We both could think clearer, like a fog had been lifted. That urge I felt did not feel like my own mind's urge. It's hard to explain. Like an urge placed there because once the sound of the water stopped, the urge stopped. The next morning we went back to the spot and went to the place where we heard the creek. We looked and looked, but we couldn't find any sort of creek or water. We later looked at some maps of where we were, and there are no creeks or water nearby. I'm scared to imagine what would have happened if we had followed the sound of the water because of the ominous presence we both felt. If I was by myself, I would have thought I was imagining it, but my friend thought, felt, and experienced everything I did. I don't know what it was, but it was eerie to say the least. What's strange is neither of us said anything to each other once we heard the sound of water, and yet we both made the decision to go look for it without asking each other, and both heard the sound of water becoming louder and quieter, even though there was nothing there. We both felt the sinister presence trying to lure us in. I'm thankful we decided to go back later, because all of it felt off. For a few years during college, I was a summer river guide in western Colorado and eastern Utah. There are two specific instances I can think of that fit this description. We were sitting on a beach eating lunch one day when we saw a bald eagle coming up and down the river. It wasn't unusual to see them swoop by, snag a fish, and fly off into the trees with it, which was usually met with gleeful applause from the customers, as if the eagle was putting on a show for them. Anyway, one day, we saw this eagle flying up and down the river, and sure enough, it grabbed a fish. As it started to climb again, out of nowhere, literally out of thin air, another smaller eagle collided with it at full speed and began battling for the fish. The fish was dropped, plummeting back to the water, and another eagle appeared, catching it mid-air and flying off with it. The other two eagles broke off and began chasing the third one, who I imagine was laughing the whole way back to its nest. Another time, we had stopped for the night. With party groups, we'd usually stop around 5 to 6 p.m. so they could enjoy a few drinks. And after dinner, I decided to take a hike while they relaxed. Don't worry, I wasn't the only guide. It was an area we frequented, and there was a ridge I liked to hike up for a great vantage point of the terrain on the other side. I was scanning the area when I saw a doe being chased by a coyote. It's not uncommon for a coyote to try and take down a deer, especially if the deer is young, sick, or lame, or if the coyote is on the brink of starvation. But it got a little stranger. The coyote chased the deer down a draw, and it looked like the deer was going to outpace him, when out of the junipers popped another coyote who joined the chase. The deer panicked and sped up, but was still well ahead of the second coyote. Meanwhile, the first coyote went up the side of the draw and disappeared. The pursuing coyote and the deer continued out of the draw onto a flat and ran for quite some distance. The deer began to outpace the second coyote when a third coyote emerged from a gully in front of her. She veered off sharply and started back in nearly the same direction they had originally come from, but one draw over. The third coyote pursued her hard and finally got close enough to start nipping at her as they entered that draw. The deer ran to the top, realizing she was cornered, and had a moment of panic where she was kicking and flailing around, trying to fend off the coyote and escape. Just as I thought she was going to make it, the other two coyotes showed up with another friend, and the four of them pounced on the deer. She went down in a cloud of dust, kicking, flailing, and trying to fight them off. Eventually, they managed to overpower her and began feeding. I've never heard of coyotes hunting in a pack like that, and after asking around, no one else I know has either. I'm not sure if I just witnessed exceptionally intelligent coyotes or some type of hybrid bred with a hunting dog or wolf. About 10 years ago, My best mate and I were both laid off from our positions at a firm in the city. We'd been there for quite some time, so the payout was reasonable. Neither of us had any real commitments keeping us tied down, so after due consideration, we decided to pack up and hike some of the Great Dividing Range. The Great Dividing Range is 3,500 km long, or 2,174 miles for those still using the imperial system. We both grew up in the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, Australia, so we decided to start from there. We left from a place called Mount Hay and headed north. We had enough provisions for 3 weeks, a lot of fireworks, used for easy fishing, compound bows, and plenty of arrows to hunt, albeit illegally, as most of it is national park land. But we didn't let that bother us. About 15 kilometers into the journey, we came around a bend in a creek and found a bunch of Legos scattered on the creek bed. I still don't know how to explain that one. That night, we shot a small wallaby and cooked it over the fire. It was tough like an old boot, but hit the spot. We slept in our swags under an overhang as it started to rain lightly. When we got up in the morning, all of the remains from the wallaby, pelt, bones, entrails, head, were gone. I suggested a fox, but my mate was a little suspicious since it was all gone. Nothing left. It was strange, but we pressed on further into the Wollongombe-Wollemi forest. We had covered about 70-80 kilometers at this stage and were pretty exhausted, so we decided to set up camp by a substantial creek. Since it was July, right in the middle of winter, we knew there would be good fishing for trout, which we could smoke and keep as supplies. We built a decent shelter and managed to live comfortably for about a week. We caught about 15 rainbow and brown trout, smoked them, and got ready to continue our journey. We headed off, walked about 500 meters, and, to our amazement, found a bush hut in the middle of nowhere, almost 40 kilometers from the nearest road. It had a billy, a cast iron cooker, and a few tins of something, which we didn't touch, and it would have saved us a lot of hassle building our own hut. About a month later, we were almost at the border of NS dollars and QLD, having covered about 450 kilometers. We set up camp again in the middle of nowhere. Around midnight, we heard something bipedal walking around the campsite. I've hunted pretty much everything except African animals all over the world, so when something walks like a human, I know it. My mate wanted to go outside and check it out, but I convinced him to stay in the tent. All we had were the bow and some hunting knives. Since there aren't any two-legged animals big enough to challenge a human in the Australian bush, I thought it might be another person. I had a few fireworks left, so I lit one, threw it out of the tent, and when it went off, this thing, whatever it was, took off through the bush with the most terrifying noise I've ever heard. It still gives me chills to this day. We didn't sleep a wink that night. When the sun came up, we found small gum trees, about as thick as a baseball bat, ripped clean out of the ground in one direction for about 20-30 meters away from the campsite, along with footprints, just like a human's but as wide as 2 of my feet, and about a size 20-25, going in the same direction. After careful consideration, we decided to leave the Tunumbar National Park, where it happened, and head to civilization. That incident scared us both. We ended up staying in a pub in Kyogle for the night, both of us looking like Tom Hanks in Castaway. The locals were in utter disbelief at what we had undertaken. The publican was a bit concerned about the compound bow strapped across my pack, but after hearing our story, he treated us to several schooners and even bought us a meal at the grill. It was a massive journey for both of us. I know this thread is about strange occurrences in the woods, so I tried to focus on the weird stuff. All in all, it was a journey in which I found myself. Highly recommended for anyone interested in doing something similar. I was camping with a group of city dwellers who had never been on a hike-in camping trip before. Needless to say, some things didn't go so well, like 2 people only bringing 1 small bottle of water, several people bringing insufficient food, and 1 couple carrying an 8-man tent between them. It was like herding cats, let me tell you. Anyway, we finally made camp, around 2 or 2:30. We were up on the cliffs with a beautiful view. We had ample time to set up camp, cook dinner, tell ghost stories, and so on. But no. These folks had the bright idea to go down to the water. "It's just right there," they pleaded. 30 minutes tops." This is nonsense. It's easily a 2-hour hike down. I know this. One other person knows this. But we felt obligated to go with these folks to keep them out of trouble. We reached the beach while the sun was setting. Now we had to hike back in the deepening darkness. There was a dim moon, and the fog was rolling in. I had the only flashlight, and the batteries gave out after a while. Of course we got lost, and I managed to take a spill, twisting my ankle pretty badly. So it's dark, the fog has visibility down further. We're lost, cold, hungry, and I'm injured. Then the other competent hiker pulls me aside and tells me in hushed, urgent tones, "I don't want to freak the others out, but something is following us back there." It comes into view and then fades back into the fog. I've never seen anything like it. As we continued on, I caught sight of a ghostly white shape, maybe 3 feet tall, moving silently but quickly along the trail we were on. Every hair on my body stood on end. It didn't stay visible for long and disappeared into the brush almost as soon as I noticed it. I caught a fleeting glimpse of it 2 more times before it disappeared for good. To this day, I have no idea what it was. I never saw it long enough or clearly enough to make even an educated guess. It did not move like any animal I'm familiar with or know is in that park. I can't tell you how relieved I was when we got above the fog, and the visibility, though still darker than a pitch-black night illuminated by a sickly candle, improved significantly. At midnight, we called for a halt. We rested for about a half hour, pooled what little food and water we had left, and tried to figure out where we were. When we got started again, we literally took 10 steps, turned a bend, and walked straight into our tents. We still tell stories about how delicious the crunchy spaghetti was that I made for everyone, one bowl at a time, that night. Honestly, I was making it so I would have an excuse to stand next to the fire, hoping that whatever it was out there would be afraid of it. Edit. Oh, and a bonus event. Later that morning, I was woken up by something underneath the tent, pushing hard into my back. I believe I screamed and scrambled out of my sleeping bag and out of the tent without ever passing through the space between those 2 points. I peered back into the tent and saw my sleeping bag jump up in a rhythmic motion. I landed on the mound with my elbow and proceeded to punch it vigorously. When the sleepiness wore off, I assumed it was a gopher, but I wasn't taking any chances after that night's misadventures. I was born ready for this thread. My pops and I are avid campers. We're not professionals anymore, but my dad used to be a wilderness guide for kids. We typically prefer the eastern and western Sierras, as they have great car camping spots next to lakes and a lot of excellent trails. Last summer, we decided to go up for a 2-night stay and do some day hiking. The campground was pretty full, which isn't unusual for the summer, but we were lucky enough, I thought at the time, to find a secluded site and set up our tents. The first night was normal, just a little bear activity, but we're used to that. On the second night, I crawled into my backpacking tent, head and toes hitting both ends, very small, and passed out cold until about 3 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of footsteps. My dad is diabetic and needs to get up to pee around 3-4 times a night. The sounds were definitely footsteps, but they were coming from the wrong direction. We were located next to the bathrooms, so the footsteps should have been moving in that direction. But they were getting closer to my tent. They stopped about a yard short, and the breathing became really heavy. I first brushed it off as my dad, maybe lost without a flashlight. The breathing went away, and I fell back asleep, only to be woken a few minutes later by breathing right above the tent. You know that rush of terror up your spine? I had that. This wasn't my dad. I lay perfectly still, but the footsteps continued to circle the tent. I had the rainfly on, so I couldn't see through the roof, and it was a new moon and pitch black. Now I convinced myself, as a heavy sleeper, that I was dreaming. Just as that thought ran through my head, I felt a single finger run the length of my foot through the tent, slow and methodical. I figured I had to be dreaming because my foot was in my sleeping bag, and I couldn't possibly feel that. But that comfort disappeared quickly when I realized, using the small ambient light available, that my foot was bare and out of the bag. I lay frozen as whatever it was stroked my foot for a minute or two, gave a few more labored breaths, and then just stood above my tent for what felt like an eternity before disappearing. I stayed up all night. In the morning, I heard my dad get out of his tent. I bolted up and met him by the fire. He looked me in the eye and asked if I had gotten up the night before. I asked him the same, and he said he had around 2 a.m., because he thought someone was going through our stuff. As I told him my story, we noticed our gear had been neatly rearranged on the table. Every item was in place, and nothing was taken. There were footprints in a perfect circle around my tent. We still can't even talk about it without getting skeeved out.